From the time we exchanged greetings, my sister-in-law didn't seem to like me. She would stare at me from head to toe with a piercing gaze and laugh at me under her breath. At the time, I could only guess that she was making fun of the way I looked. I must have seemed like someone she could easily make fun of or put down to make herself feel better. That's why, when she asked for my help, I refused. I couldn't think of a single reason for me to help her. A story by Maria Bailey. My name is Maria. I got married to my husband 3 years ago, and now we live with my in-laws. My father-in-law passed away when my husband was a student, so today it's me, my husband, and my sister-in-law and mother-in-law living together. Initially, there was no plan to live together. It was just my husband and me. However, a year after getting married, my mother-in-law had an accident and hurt her leg, so we decided to move in with her so that we could help care for her. My sister-in-law, Dorothy, was already living at home, but finally my mother-in-law tearfully told my husband that she was unreliable. As it turned out, Dorothy wasn't contributing to the household expenses at all. She was single and spent her money going out to bars and clubs. It would be nice if she could have at least supported her mother, but instead she caused trouble by maxing out credit cards, asking her mom for money, or leaving her to do all the housework, even though she had a bad leg from her accident. Honestly, I think my mother-in-law is far too lenient on her daughter. Dorothy is in her late 20s, but I guess parents always feel compelled to take care of their children, no matter how old they are. That's why, even though my mother-in-law admits her daughter is unreliable, she feels she can't kick her out and lets her stay at home. Of course, I didn't want to live with them. My mother-in-law is a kind and gentle person, but that's a separate issue, and it takes some resolve to suddenly learn how to live together, no matter how nice the person is. And above all, I hated the idea of living with my sister-in-law. I wouldn't have lived with Dorothy, even if I were paid to. I felt she looked down on me since the beginning of our marriage. To put it simply, Dorothy is like the controlling leader who would rotate out one friend at a time from the group during school days. I might sound childish for saying this, but I've always thought she was a malicious person who never grew out of that habit of using people for her own advantage. I felt that she didn't like me from the moment my husband introduced me to her. She asked my name, and when I answered, she stifled a laugh. I'm 32 years old. Turns out that laugh was because I was younger than she had thought. I'm sorry, I thought you were about 40. You look so mature. To put it bluntly, she probably wanted to say that I looked older. Since then, every time she saw me, she would ask about the brands of my clothes, comment on my appearance, and look down on me with a mocking laugh. A grown-up over 30 wearing fast fashion. Oh my, but Maria seems out of touch, doesn't she? Were you homeschooled or something? You don't seem like you'd get along with the fashionistas like my friends are. Of course, I'm not the type to stand out, and I'm not particularly interested in fashion. Dorothy may be able to believe that I don't dress well, but that doesn't mean she has any right to ridicule me. Moreover, I do have friends. Not many, but they're there. I feel sorry for the people who say they like me when I'm being ridiculed so much. I knew we didn't get along immediately, but it has only seemed to get worse. If she's going to have this attitude, I decided that I just need to avoid her as much as possible. With that in mind, I decided to ignore her without arguing or pointing out her faults in return. All of a sudden, my mother-in-law needed help, and the discussion of living together came up. I told my husband that I absolutely didn't want to live with Dorothy, but then my mother-in-law called and asked if I would reconsider. My mother-in-law was 62 at the time, and apparently had plans to move into a senior living facility with support services when she turned 65 in 3 more years. She asked if we could please share a home until then. Faced with such a desperate plea, I couldn't find the words to refuse. Limited-term cohabitation. It was a big ask, but it was only for a fixed amount of time. That was my motivation for deciding to live together. So that's the backstory, and now my husband and I are living with his mother and sister. It's already been 2 years, so there's only about 1 year left. My mother-in-law is keeping her promise and is actively looking for supportive housing facility so the cohabitation won't drag on indefinitely. I feel a little guilty, as if I'm driving her out, but my mother-in-law, sensing my feelings, reassures me that this was her intention from the beginning. She probably wanted to take her time sorting out the house during these 3 years. In retrospect, I feel a little guilty for not agreeing to live together from the start. Of course, the idea of living with my sister-in-law was truly unpleasant, so I needed time to brace myself, and living with her has been difficult. Even now, I struggle with the day-to-day interactions of sharing a home with her. When we first started living together, she was particularly harsh on me, complaining about the food I cooked and constantly criticizing my cleaning. My mother-in-law and husband would scold her for complaining, but she seemed completely unfazed. It feels like she doesn't think of me as her brother's wife. but more like a slave or a maid. For about a week I was blamed for the way I washed her clothes. "You shrank my clothes because of the detergent you chose. They're all misshapen and unwearable now. You've been married for 3 years and you still can't handle housework. You are essentially useless." I wanted to tell her that it wasn't my fault the clothes shrank. It was actually because my sister-in-law had gained weight. However, I didn't want to comment on someone's appearance. I know how hurtful those comments can be. I said I'd be more careful next time and tried to end the conversation. But my sister-in-law is not the type to forgive and forget any mistake made against her. When my mother-in-law's acquaintance visited our home, Dorothy laughed as she talked about how terrible I was at housework. Of course my mother-in-law defended me, but Dorothy insisted there was no need and kept talking as if I were a completely useless home appliance, not a human being or her relative. Sometimes I'd argue back, but mostly I'd just nod and let her talk wash over me. I didn't want to stoop to her level, and I knew that arguing with her would be a waste of breath. I told my mother-in-law and husband that after we stopped living together this year, I don't want to have anything to do with Dorothy, and both of them agreed. It might be a bit spiteful, but I think Dorothy will struggle when my mother-in-law moves into a senior living facility. She's been living at home and spending her salary however she wants. I don't think someone like that can suddenly live on her own responsibly. We won't help her once we stop living together. That's my little revenge. But sometimes it seems like even God is on my sister-in-law's side. She told me that her boyfriend had proposed to her. "My boyfriend's tall, and he's handsome. He's so kind. He has a great job at a huge company, so I'm basically marrying into money. I'm so glad I put effort into my looks and fashion. I wouldn't want a miserable life like someone I know, living with in-laws after marriage." She chuckled while looking at me, making it obvious she was talking about me. Dorothy stood before me, smirking, and said, "I bet you thought I wouldn't be able to live on my own without my mom. Too bad for you, old lady." I couldn't help but blush a little because she hit the nail on the head with what I was thinking about her. At the same time, I felt a strong wave of frustration. "Congratulations on your engagement. But married life is tough, you know." She might complain about me not being able to do housework, but the one who really can't do anything is Dorothy. It was the best comeback I could muster, but she just looked triumphant. "Are you trying to act tough because I won't be around? My fiancé is rich and will hire a professional housekeeper, not someone useless like you." I was utterly defeated. I swore I would never see Dorothy again once we stopped living together. I swallowed my pride and decided to avoid her as much as possible at home for the remaining time we had as housemates. A month after Dorothy's announcement, her fiancé came to visit. I thought anyone who would choose her must not be a good person. I even had such a terrible thought. I had been warned by Dorothy not to introduce myself to her fiancé. "I don't consider you family. Once you've served tea, just go away. I'm not inviting you to the wedding anyway." I felt relieved when I heard those words. I just wanted to cut ties with her as soon as possible. When her fiancé arrived, I reluctantly served tea as instructed. Knowing this might be the first and last time we'd meet, I stole a quick glance at Dorothy's fiancé's face. As I did so, our eyes met. And it was inevitable. "You are—" As her fiancé began to speak, Dorothy interrupted, saying it wasn't a big deal. "She's our housekeeper, so you don't have to worry, Steve. I told you before, right, that I have a useless sister-in-law who can't do anything. It's a loss just to get involved with her, so you can ignore her." Upon hearing those words, I bowed my head slightly to her fiancé and left the room, feeling embarrassed. Then Dorothy's fiancé called me by my name. "Maria, you were a senior consultant at the firm, right? I can't believe you're married to Dorothy's brother." Steve stared at me in disbelief. In fact, he was familiar to me. He was my junior at work until I quit after getting married. I had heard that he changed jobs after that, but neither of us had ever imagined we would meet again like this. "Dorothy, I've heard a lot about your sister-in-law before, but I never knew it was Maria. I thought she must be a terrible person because you've only said bad things about her. But we used to work together. I know who she is." Dorothy didn't seem to understand why Steve was angry. I wondered just how badly my character had been misrepresented, and I felt a little anxious. "You two knew each other?" At Dorothy's bitter smile and question, Steve desperately explained how we had worked closely together. I had helped him at work before and even lent him money when his mother was sick and needed money for surgery. It felt only natural for me to help him as his senior at work, and I had lent him money because he was in real trouble. At that time, my grandfather had just passed away and left me some inheritance, so I was easily in a position to be able to help him. I felt there was no need for Steve to feel so indebted to me, but when I took a moment to think about it and put myself in his shoes, I realized that the money must have been a real lifesaver. Maria was a true friend to me, and yet you treat her like a housekeeper? I knew you could be harsh with your words, but I can't stand someone who treats people like this. I clearly need to rethink this. Our engagement is off. With a cold, incredulous gaze, Steve told Dorothy he was breaking off their engagement and tried to leave his seat. Desperate to stop him, Dorothy grabbed his jacket as he got up from the sofa. "No, it's not like that. This is just how Maria and I communicate. We joke around a lot. Right, Maria?" Dorothy looked to me for help in a panic, but I could only shake my head. "Sorry, I can't lie." Upon hearing this, Dorothy broke down crying on the spot. "Why are you ruining my marriage? It's your fault the engagement is off," she yelled and raised her hand to strike me, but my husband rushed in at that moment to intervene and held her back from hitting me. Still lashing out at me, Dorothy was slapped by my mother-in-law. "It's not Maria's fault. It's yours. You've been harassing her and causing trouble all this time. I won't tolerate it anymore. It's your own fault the engagement is off. You need to take accountability for your actions. You will leave the house by end of the month." This was the moment my mother-in-law finally snapped and moved to cut ties with her own daughter. "Mom, you're on Maria's side, too?" With a face of disbelief, Dorothy tearfully stared at her mother. "You are not a child anymore. Take care of yourself." Mother-in-law said this, bowed her head to Steve, and returned to her bedroom. From the other room, only Dorothy's sobbing could be heard. Steve told me he would be in touch soon, and then left our house. My husband and I exchanged glances and sighed together. Maybe it's time for us to start looking for a new home. My husband nodded at my words, and from then on we decided to move on with our lives as if Dorothy didn't exist. 3 months have passed since then, and my mother-in-law has moved to a senior housing facility. We also moved to a place as close as possible to my mother-in-law, and we are in the process of selling the family home. Dorothy stayed locked up in her room until the day we moved, but of course we couldn't just leave her behind, so we forcibly packed her belongings into boxes and sent them to a storage unit. On the day of the move, we gave my sister-in-law the bare essentials, the key to the storage unit, and the $3,000 severance payment we had received from my mother-in-law. Dorothy seemed to have lost all motivation due to her broken engagement, and quit her job. I don't know what happened to her after that, and it seems Steve isn't in contact with her anymore. Steve told me that he was saved, once again, thanks to me. If I had gone through with that marriage, I would have definitely regretted it. You've always been my lifesaver, really. I can't help but feel guilty, thinking that in a way, Steve is the one who's been my lifesaver. I also wished for my sister-in-law to struggle in the end. But maybe if you do good deeds, you'll be rewarded like this. At least, that's what I thought this time. My sister-in-law treated me like a slave and constantly harassed me, which is probably why it ended like this. I've never seen or felt God, but from now on, I want to live a life where I can hold my head up high.
9 people? That's just too many. What do you think this is, a baseball team? I've always had a dream since I was a child. A cute house like the ones in picture books, with a white dog in the yard. But reality isn't always so sweet. I finally managed to get my own house. But when I returned from work, it had transformed into something like a dormitory. I won't forgive them for this. My name is Mary, a 32-year-old office worker. I've been focused on my career, but since my late 20s, my friends started getting married one after another. There were months when wedding gifts really added up to my expenses. Feeling a mysterious urgency, I started trying my hand at dating.
Mary, when are you going to give me grandkids?
Every time I visited home, my dad, David, would say this, and it made me so uncomfortable that I gradually stopped visiting as much. My mom passed away when I was young, so I grew up with my dad, my brother, and my paternal grandparents. My brother married early and built a house near our childhood home. He has 2 daughters, my adorable nieces. I've got cute nieces at my brother's place. Isn't that enough for you?
But you, Mary.
We always ended up arguing about it. Then, after a while, my dad was involved in a traffic accident. By the time I got to the hospital, he was in a very bad state. My energetic father quietly passed away while my brother's family and I watched over him. Dad, I had someone I wanted you to meet. Actually, at that time I had a boyfriend, introduced to me by a friend. He had just proposed, and we'd decided to marry. He was a bit of a show-off, but a kind man. His name was Richard. Now with both my parents gone and my brother having his own family, it's gotten lonely, hasn't it? I muttered this, stroking my cat Lucy after returning home from the funeral.
Mary, you're not alone. You're going to be a part of my family.
Richard, sitting next to me, gently held my hand. He came to check on me, worried about how I was doing.
Let's build a happy home together.
I thought I could have an ordinary happiness. Little did I know back then what would happen. Welcome! It's a bit cramped, though. I visited Richard's family home for a family meeting. Patricia, his mother, spoke plainly and was full of energy. I hesitated as I entered the room, thinking it would be just the in-laws, but it was crowded with in-laws, step-grandparents, Richard's brother Charles, and his wife Sarah, and their kids, Thomas and John. Nice to meet you. Wow, that's a lot of people. The house, built by James, Richard's father, felt somewhat run down. Honestly, it was old, but the family welcomed me warmly, easing my nerves. On the way back in the car, speaking of which, there were so many people today. Christmas or Thanksgiving must be quite an event, I said to Richard, who laughed in response.
It really is cramped there. Can't believe they manage to live like that every day.
Hearing this, I was genuinely surprised. Richard's family home was never really spacious. I thought it was just a temporary gathering. 8 people in that house? Wow, that's something. Richard said it was originally just the 4 of them, his in-laws and step-grandparents. But then Charles, who couldn't hold down a job, moved in one day with Sarah and their kids without asking.
Charles will probably move out once he finds a stable job,
Richard said with a laugh. Back then I just thought Richard's family had its challenges, nothing more. After marriage, Richard and I, along with our cat Lucy, lived a peaceful life without kids yet. Richard was fairly helpful around the house, and Lucy was fond of us. As for his family, Charles and his family were still living in that house. The walls were covered in children's scribbles, and Patricia laughed, saying she gave up on cleaning them long ago. Sarah, Charles's wife, always looked tired. She was older than Charles and close to my age, so we became friends quickly. Hey, Sarah, hurry up!
Mary, don't just stand there. We're out of beer.
Whenever I visited, it seemed like Sarah and I were the only ones not sitting down. We were constantly busy, and I wondered if this was our fate. But the thought of Sarah doing this every day was honestly frightening. Sarah worked full-time, filling in for Charles, who hardly worked. I hesitated to ask, but finally did. Have you ever thought about leaving him? I've heard that before. Well, it's tough as it is, but we have kids, and he used to be so kind. I couldn't see any good in Charles, but I guess they had their reasons. That's what I thought. It was around this time.
How about we build our own house?
Richard suddenly suggested. I was surprised, but also happy. Actually, I've had a small dream since I was little. I'd always dreamed of living in a quaint house like those in storybooks, with a white dog in the yard. I have a white dog in the garden. I'd never told anyone, but when I shared this dream with Richard, a bit shyly.
That sounds great,
he said. We spent our free days visiting model homes, choosing a housemaker, and a year later, our dream home was completed.
We've got to make sure we keep up with the mortgage,
Richard said. Absolutely, I replied with a smile. On the first weekend after moving in, Richard's family came over for a housewarming party. Here, Joseph, hand over the gift. We're coming in. Oh, what a lovely house! Patricia seemed quite pleased, as if it was her own home. I smiled politely.
Look, it's a celebration!
And then Joseph handed me 2 cans of beer, looking like he'd just bought them. I mean, seriously? Charles wandered around the house and finding our bedroom, exclaimed, "Oh, this bed is super comfy!" Saying that, Charles started rolling around on the bed. The kids, following their father's lead, got excited.
Look, there's a cat!
They ran around, chasing our pet cat Lucy. Lucy is friendly, but she had never met so many people at once, so she got scared and hid in the back of the room. Poor Lucy. I glanced at Charles and Richard, who had already started a party with the in-laws. Mary, Patricia is insisting on appetizers quickly. Can I use your kitchen? And sorry about scaring Lucy, Sarah said apologetically. Why is someone as nice as her with a guy like that? I had grown to care for Sarah like a real sister. I'll handle it, Sarah. You relax, I said, but she still helped with the cooking while managing the kids. The step-grandparents were always quiet, almost like dolls, not talking much. But they said, "What a lovely home, right, James?"
Yeah, sorry for the noise,
James replied, even though the loud ones were the in-laws. The step-grandparents were the ones with common sense in that house. In other words, the odd ones out were the in-laws, Charles, and probably my husband Richard too. From then on, the in-laws and Charles would visit our house almost every weekend. They partied till dawn. So loud that we got complaints from neighbors and even the police ones. The step-grandparents, Sarah, and the kids hadn't visited our house since the housewarming. But the in-laws didn't hesitate to put me to work. I was at my wits' end. Richard had also started showing his true colors. Once, I had a cold. I was too weak to prepare dinner and asked Richard, who was home early from work, to pick something up. He came back with 2 hamburgers. I couldn't even think of eating them. Why hamburgers? I can't eat this right now, I said without thinking, instead of getting angry.
What are you talking about, Mary? You need to eat to get your strength back,
Richard said. What? If I had the energy to eat that, I wouldn't have asked for help in the first place. I thought to myself. By the way, when Richard was sick once, "Want a hamburger?" I asked him sarcastically. His response was,
"No, that's ridiculous. Are you trying to annoy me?"
That's what I said. In short, this family was self-centered and lacked empathy. They were done for as people. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. I'll make sure you all get what you deserve. With that thought, I smirked wickedly. A few days later, I had a business trip scheduled. On the morning of my departure, "Well, I'm off then," I said cheerfully to Richard.
Was your business trip starting today? What a coincidence. Sarah is also on a business trip from today,
said Richard. Really? I had no idea. What a coincidence, I replied.
Mom said they'd be in trouble without someone to take care of the house.
Richard laughed mockingly, making me think, what a jerk. I was busy during my time away from home. Days flew by quickly, and before I knew it, a lot of time had passed. A major typhoon hit, and I contacted Richard.
We're fine, but the family home had some serious leaks,
he replied. Thinking of the old family home, I felt it was understandable. The day I returned home arrived. As I walked from the nearest bus stop to my house, I heard loud, unrefined laughter echoing in the residential area. Is someone having a barbecue in their yard? The noise was that loud. This will surely attract complaints from the neighbors. Wait, what? I was shocked. The loud voices were unmistakably coming from my house. As I cautiously opened the door, I found many bags in the entrance, and the walls were covered in graffiti. Stunned, I was at a loss for words.
Hey, Mary, welcome back!
A drunken Richard greeted me. Frustrated by his insensitivity, I entered the living room to find equally drunk in-laws and Charles, with Sarah making appetizers for them in the kitchen. The step-grandparents were quiet as usual, and the kids were happily drawing on the living room walls. Then there was another young woman I didn't know. Overwhelmed by everything, I felt my mind about to snap. What is all this? I asked Richard calmly, trying not to get emotional.
Didn't I tell you? The family home had leaks because of the typhoon.
I heard that part. And then? Richard's story was this. The family home had a massive leak, and the in-laws, having nowhere else to go, temporarily moved into our house. Without Sarah, who was away, the in-laws, Charles and Richard, decided,
We thought, why not live here?
Richard said proudly. What? Even with this explanation, I was baffled. To my silence,
It's fine, we're family. We have extra rooms, no problem,
the in-laws added, smiling.
It's all right, Mary. The walls got a bit dirty, but it's just kid stuff,
Charles said nonchalantly. And who is that woman? I asked about the woman lounging on the sofa, fiddling with her phone.
Oh, that's Karen, a mutual friend of me and Sarah. Right, Sarah?
Charles asked her. Yeah, that's right, she answered with a smile.
This girl, Karen, was kicked out by her parents, and Richard said it was okay for her to stay.
Thanks in advance, the not-so-bright-looking girl replied, leaving me utterly confused. In our not-so-spacious living room, there were 9 adults and 2 children. The room was a mess, the walls covered in scribbles, making it look nothing like a new house. The family was loud like a dormitory. I couldn't help but lose my temper. Seriously? 9 people is too many. Are you guys planning to start a baseball team or what? Then I realized something. Hey, where's Lucy? Our pet cat Lucy was nowhere to be found. When I asked Richard and the others, they all claimed ignorance, while frantically searching for Lucy.
Lucy, huh? Dad opened the window to smoke and she ran away,
Thomas told me. Charles glared at the boy as if he had said something he shouldn't have. What were you thinking? I told you to be careful with the windows, I said, near tears. Richard, looking annoyed, said,
Oh, come on. It's just a cat. We can get another one. What's with you? If you're unhappy, we can just get divorced, you know.
He said it with such a disdainful face. You just said divorce? I asked.
Yeah, I did. I might consider not doing it if you apologize to us.
Richard, along with the in-laws and Charles, seemed confident that I wouldn't go through with a divorce. I replied, Oh, really? Well, then here, write this. I slammed down the divorce papers I had prepared. My section was already filled out. I fetched my pre-packed bags from my room. Done? Why haven't you written it yet? I'm busy, you know, and said coolly to Richard. They were all shocked by my preparedness. Angrily, Patricia said, Richard,
Divorce this woman already. We've built the house, so she's useless now.
Patricia said that. Realizing too late, Richard said,
Right, Mary. You'll regret divorcing me.
But I had no regrets. What are you talking about? You're the one who's going to struggle. Just write the divorce papers. Once Richard finished writing, I snatched the papers and put them in my bag. Then I went to Charles and said, Here, you need to write this too, handing him the divorce papers. He laughed.
What? When did I marry you?
Looking at the filled in wife section, Charles said,
Hey, Sarah, this is...
Sarah coldly stared at Charles and said, I'm divorcing you. Write it now, please. To which Charles exclaimed,
Sarah, bite the hand that feeds you, huh?
Joseph was talking nonsense. From my perspective, Sarah had been living like a slave in her in-laws' house. The money she earned was mostly taken by Charles, leaving only a little for living expenses. The money let Charles do whatever he wanted, and the not-so-bright girl in front of me, she was Charles's mistress. Mary, I think my husband is cheating on me. Sarah had confided in me just before Richard suggested building a house. Sarah had been enduring it all for the sake of her children. But recently, Charles had even started selling Sarah's belongings and the kids' toys for his own gain. She had reached her limit. Then Sarah told me a story. After hearing Sarah's story, I was furious. From that day, Sarah and I started planning our divorces. Sarah gathered thorough evidence of the affair. Her recent business trip was a lie. We met halfway to look for a new place to live. Like me, Sarah's parents had passed away, and she had no relatives to turn to. However, a close friend offered her a job at their shop in another state. It was a good location, and our preparations went smoothly. All that was left was to present the divorce papers. I want to get some people out of that hellish house. Sarah had made up her mind and was incredibly strong. She had a strong core, but had been used by her in-laws like she was brainwashed. Thinking it would look suspicious to return together, Sarah went back first. She soon contacted me, informing me about the takeover of my house and Charles's brazen mistress moving in. All our conversations and actions until then were a performance. Knowing what was going on, I told Sarah, We're not living in that house anymore. Let the kids draw on the walls all they want. That's what I told him. Charles, thinking he could now openly live with his mistress, happily signed the divorce papers. Let's go, Sarah. James and everyone, it's time to leave. The step-grandparents stood up and followed Sarah and her children to the door.
Living with people like you, I had given up on life, but Sarah opened my eyes. Do as you please now,
James said, glaring at the family, and left with his great-grandchildren. The in-laws had been taking money from the step-grandparents as pensions. They were truly awful people. Well then, take care, we said as we left like a storm.
You'll regret this.
The family laughed as we left, but we ignored them. Months later, Richard contacted me. Oh, I forgot to block him. I could guess the content of the call, so I answered.
Mary, come back!
Richard sounded desperate. I barely contained my laughter. Come back? We're strangers now, I replied calmly. Let me talk. Mary, what do you mean? Why aren't you paying the mortgage? Patricia's voice came through, probably snatching the phone from Richard. What are you talking about? I have no idea. I played dumb, while Patricia sounded frustrated. Apparently, the house's mortgage had already fallen behind last month. When I pressed Richard, He claimed I hadn't been paying the mortgage. What an inconvenience. While I remained silent, Patricia kept talking like a machine gun. First of all, this house, you guys had a combined income of $75,000, right? We could have built a better house. We built this as a new home, but it's not what we expected. Originally, they had planned to take over the house. Sarah had informed me of their discussions. Yes, that's true. But with Richard's $30,000 salary, the bank wouldn't lend us more. If we had taken a joint mortgage, maybe we could have gotten a better house. Hearing this, Richard, you lied! I could hear Richard and Patricia arguing on the phone. I ignored them, ended the call, and finally blocked his number. Richard had a pretentious personality. Richard always wanted to impress others, especially outside his family. When he suggested building a house, I already had divorce in mind. I told him, a friend's husband got a mortgage on his own. How cool is that? I heard these stories like a spell. Richard, wanting to show off, opted for a solo mortgage. I had to hold back my laughter. He probably didn't tell his family because he was afraid of them knowing the truth. But I didn't care. The house was built to Richard's taste. I had no attachment to it anymore. Richard hadn't cheated, but there were no alimony or penalties in our divorce. So, to spite him, I left him with the mortgage debt as my revenge. Let him suffer. And I was able to rescue Sarah, whom I cared for like a sister, from that house. That was my main goal. Later, they couldn't pay the mortgage and the new house was repossessed. But it was a mess inside, with scribbles everywhere, and walls yellowed by cigarette smoke from Charles and his mistress. It didn't look like a recently built house. Richard had to rent a cheap apartment and Joseph and Patricia ended up moving in with him. They'll probably never leave him alone, like parasites. I don't care they're strangers to me now. The only good thing about my former in-laws was that the children weren't affected. Otherwise, they were the worst. Sarah, as Charles's ex-wife, successfully claimed alimony through a lawyer. She had to borrow money, but managed to pay it off. I'm glad for her. Charles and his mistress became outcasts in their community and are now missing. They haven't repaid their debts, confirming how awful they are. Sarah is happily working at her friend's place. Her kids are doing well too. I hope they find happiness this time. James and Barbara seem brighter now, like a weight has been lifted. They sold the old family home and are enjoying their retirement in a distant place with their savings. That's great news. As for me, I've requested a transfer to a local office. I was reunited with Lucy, my cat. Thanks to social media, someone in the neighborhood had found and taken care of her. It's good she's friendly. Now, I live alone in my late father's house. With my brother's approval, I'm saving to build my dream house. And someday, I hope to introduce someone special at my father's grave. Today, I'm working hard towards that goal.